Hello and welcome everybody to our latest live panel discussion as part of our virtual Sustainable Packaging Summit. My name is Elisabeth Skura. I'm the editor-at-large at Packaging Europe. So in a world where the effects of climate change are becoming ever more obvious around the globe, reaching net zero carbon emissions becomes ever more important. At the same time, the growing packaging waste problem needs to be tackled by developing more circular packaging. But how can the packaging industry get there and achieve these goals? It obviously can play a very important role in that. When we hosted a discussion panel about reaching net zero at our Sustainable Packaging Summit in Lisbon in September, it was pointed out that in the area of FMCG, 20 to 40% of a product's carbon footprint are caused by packaging, which sort of illustrates the important role packaging can play in all this. And many companies have made pledges to reach net zero by 2040, and the European Union's Green Deal also sets out to aim to be carbon neutral by 2050. In our panel discussion today, our speakers will explore challenges, roadblocks, innovation strategies and solutions on the path towards net zero circularity. We also have a bit of time at the end of the session for audience questions, so feel free to pop them into the comments on LinkedIn, and we'll put them to our speakers towards the end of the session. So without further ado, I'm very pleased to welcome our panelists for this session who have taken time out of their busy schedule today to be with us. So we have Shruti George, who is Vice President for Strategic Innovation Platforms at Avery Dennison. We also have Peter Sandkühler, who is Director of Sustainability at EMEA at Dow Packaging and Specialty Plastics. We have Marco Maccarati, who is Group Sales Director Packaging, FMCG and Retailer at Mondi Group. And last but definitely not least, we have Sarah Laidler, who is Senior Consultant at the Carbon Trust. So to get us started, could you all maybe briefly introduce yourselves and tell us about your role at your company? Maybe starting with you, Shruti.
Thanks, Elizabeth. Hello, everyone. I'm Shruti George. I basically run what we call a strategic innovation platform, which is for sustainability for our 5.5 billion global labels business. And what I do basically is kind of figure out net zero and kind of material circularity and kind of understand how do we get there from an innovation perspective. So I don't do a lot of the ESG pieces, or the compliance pieces. It's all about innovation. And that is and I'm very passionate about it. And I think that's the only way we can get to net zero before 2050 and kind of reduce the impact that packaging can have in the ecosystem.
Absolutely, yes. We definitely need people with passion to sort of solve this burning problem. Peter, would you like to go next, maybe, to introduce yourself?
Absolutely. Thanks very much for having me on this panel, first of all, and welcome everybody. My name is Peter Sandkühler. I'm, as mentioned, Director for Sustainability in our business in packaging in Europe. And my role encompasses what we could call the transformational change of the business to a net zero and circular business. And that involves our efforts in chemical recycling, mechanical recycling, bio-based feedstocks eventually, and as well design for recyclability efforts, but ultimately as well how to reduce our carbon emissions in our processes, scope 1, 2, 3, and how we eventually make this overall long-term sustainable, reach our net zero goals by 2050. And the whole infrastructure ecosystem around this is part of me and my teams, and being part of a broader team here, obviously effort to make Dow more sustainable.
Great, thank you, Peter. And Marco, would you like to go next and tell us a bit about yourself and your role?
Yeah, thank you, Elizabeth. And as Peter said, thank you so much for this opportunity to be here at this panel and to talk about the Mondi journey towards net zero and how we can contribute our customer to achieve the same goal. Yes, I'm part of the family, of the Mondi family, since 20 years. I have always been in the in the sales side, and in the last 5 years, I've spent much more of the time to listen to the customer's voice as the sustainability agenda is rising in importance in the commercial discussions. And so I bring Mondi's finest capabilities and mind and innovation to reduce the scope 3 emissions of our customers, specifically through action with retailers, where the retailers have the pulse on the market of what consumers are saying and what the consumer are wishing to have in terms of sustainable packaging. We will talk probably later about our approach. It's called Eco Solutions, and thank you for the opportunity again.
Definitely, yes. It's such an important topic. So yeah, I'm looking forward to hearing everybody's perspective. And yeah, last but not least, Sarah, would you like to introduce yourself as well?
Sure, of course. Thank you very much for having me, Elizabeth. It's really great to be part of this opportunity. My name's Sarah Laidler. I'm a senior consultant at the Carbon Trust. For those of you who don't know, the Carbon Trust are a mission-led organisation with the mission to accelerate towards a decarbonised economy. I personally sit within business services, which is a sub-team of Carbon Trust that primarily works with corporates to help them carbon footprint and also set ambitious targets in line with science-based targets and also net zero as well. On top of the more recent months, I've also helped organizations build on these targets with net zero feasibility studies on how those could be achieved. And I also have a sector specialism within the plastic sector, combining how circularity and decarbonisation can go hand in hand.
Thank you, Sarah. So yeah, I thought to start with, it would be good to define what we're actually talking about. Obviously, there's lots of different ways and methods of calculating carbon emissions, and there's sort of debate on what net zero actually means. And Sarah, I was wondering, is there a standard approach that you sort of work with or that you sort of recommend?
Specifically, when sort of dealing with net zero, there is a short answer, I guess, for that. And when setting targets, companies have had to evolve to make their claim very credible. Since the birth of science-based targets in 2015 from the Paris Agreement, when countries signed up to keep global warming to well below 2 degrees and now more in line with a 1.5 degree world, what counts as a science-based target is basically a target that aligns with that science that we will keep global warming to well below 2 degrees or 1.5. And from that development, they officially launched the net zero standard last year. So when we think about net zero and we're explaining it to corporates from the Carbon Trust, we think about it in terms of you are prioritizing decarbonisation as much as possible. And it is an ambitious target to commit to, it is an ambitious target to achieve, because you're essentially saying that across your entire value chain, which is your scope 1 and 2 and 3 emissions, you're committing to a 90% overall reduction within that. And you're committing to that you will decarbonize as much as possible within a 90% threshold. And the remaining 10% you're allowed to offset through a greenhouse gas removal system. So you're effectively taking the carbon dioxide out the air at the end of your decarbonisation journey. So that is very ambitious, and behind the SBTi guidance around net zero sits the Greenhouse Gas Protocol, in which our emissions are calculated. So like I said, we do a lot of work with understanding what baseline footprint should be and meeting the criteria for net zero and science-based targets. But when we contextualize that in terms of plastic specifically, or packaging specifically rather, there's a bit of overlap with what looks at sort of life cycle assessment studies. So you can look at it on a per product basis. Which is often where other standards come in, such as carbon neutrality, to look at on a more product scale. But essentially, when looking at it as a net zero, it's important to make sure that we're aligned with what's the most credible and what's the most ambitious, which would be the SBTi standard.
Great, thank you, Sarah. And yeah, I wanted to get everybody else's thoughts on what sort of different methods you use, or what roles different methods like LCA or PCF could and should do in packaging. So yeah, let's maybe start with you, Peter, if you have any thoughts on that.
No, certainly. And I think Sarah laid it out quite clearly that ultimately we're looking for using product life cycle or life cycle analysis, and product carbon footprints is a subset to that, as a tool to qualify what kind of packagings we actually want to develop. So if we compare different alternatives for a certain packaging solution, life cycle analysis really helps us to clarify which materials and which products for a given purpose makes the most sense to achieve the lowest carbon footprint achievable in that scenario. So we are very much versed, and we have a whole team of LCA experts that look at these different packaging solutions or the materials that we provide for packaging solutions, how we can help the industry to reduce the overall product carbon footprints of the products that are put on the market, and also helps us to define the strategies for decarbonization and how we ultimately will, over the next coming years, bring down the product carbon footprints of our products by basically providing more transparency across the different product categories that we bring as Dow Chemical to the market and also to packaging.
Great, thank you, Peter. Do any of the other speakers have any thoughts on this?
I think we tend to use carbon as a shorthand for everything, and part of what we're trying to do at Avery is actually to talk about, as both Peter and Sarah alluded to, what is a broader context, right? What are we doing with the water? What are we doing with the overall aspect of both the product carbon footprint, but just as well as a company, what are we doing in terms of sustainability, right? And that includes thinking about circularity just as much as talking about what's the carbon impact of what we're putting out into the market. What is the water impact? What are we doing with the wastewater? How are we looking at recycling systems differently as well?
Yeah, let me add on Shruti. I fully agree with the input from everybody, but definitely the fundamentals of the business has to be right. While an LCA can give an indication of what is the carbon footprint in a contextual situation, the first problem to be solved is how we can bring the product with the lowest carbon footprint, because we look at our operations, at the energy, at the supply chain, so the scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions to lower that the minimums as possible. And to do this, there is only one way, and this was actually mentioned before by Sarah. The Science-Based Target Initiative is a very credible approach. It is standardized and credible to consumers. And thanks to a standard-based target initiative that we started a long time ago, we can actually say that 46% of our carbon emissions has been reduced, setting the baseline from 2004. So it's important to have a credible system, and the core of the business, the fundamental of the business, are safe.
Thank you, Marco. And obviously we have a group of major players in the packaging industry around the sort of virtual table today from a range of different backgrounds, and I wanted to ask each of you, just to sort of get an idea, how far along are your companies on the journey towards net zero?
I can take it since
You're very polite.
Yeah, that in Monday we're working basically on 4 areas. First of all, we mentioned before we have a science-based target with scope 1 and scope 2 targets that have been approved. But we also announced a commitment just this year to try to achieve the net zero, which by net zero we also have to understand, and Shruti said it before, what do we mean with that? It's only about emissions, or there are also other aspects like zero waste that can be addressed to other actions. But so we have targets that have been approved, and these goes along with the large investments that Mondi has made since 2015. And we talk about 650 million euro that goes directly into the mill, which is our core business. The second pillar is that we look at the renewables. And so 80% of our energy is renewable energy, which create also very strong resilience in the crisis that we're living today. We work on designing sustainable packaging because the sustainable packaging, the way we define it as a combination of the scope 1, 2, and 3, has a direct impact on the scope 3 of our customers. And so we look for them with the lowest carbon footprint and with the best end of life. So recyclability, compostability, or reusability. And we will continue to work, last point, on our climate change, on our forest management, on water usage, where we can say proudly that in the last 2 years, CDP awarded us with a AAA. It's something that happens only one of 14 companies worldwide. So it's a journey, it goes on different fronts, and every front is well served.
So we have been spending a lot of time trying to reduce our scope 1 and 2 emissions, very specifically picking up on just the carbon piece. So from we'd gotten to around 30% reduction over 2015. We've hit that and we've exceeded it. And now we've put a 70% goal just for scope 1 and 2 emissions by the end of 2030. We'll be looking at 70% for the whole company. And again, we're very much on track to do that. And I think there are 4 things that we're doing broadly from a sustainability standpoint to make sure that we actually get to net zero by 2050, again, with a 1.5 degree Celsius reduction goal with SBTi as well, because we've also gotten our goals approved. The first one is actually, on the whole, we are looking at all of the levels. So reduction of our products. So how do you reduce the carbon through labels on the whole, and really kind of drive that, which then really is a way for us to reduce our impact on the ecosystem. The second thing is around enabling circularity of the packages we're on, which is absolutely critical, given that labels can be a contaminant in recycling waste streams. So a lot of the work that we do is around the circularity, going and understanding how do you design packaging differently, and that is essentially the work that as a company we undertake for customers that ask us to help out. The third thing is really what we also sell RFID tags, and with the digital passport coming out in Europe, which is a big deal, as you know, and we kind of want to enable that transition for not just our products, but whatever we are actually putting information on or decoration on. We want to be able to kind of help put the DPP out into the market and just kind of enable transparency of the supply chain, which is so important going forward. And then the last thing is kind of putting our money where our mouth is. So in really thinking about investments more systematically, how do you invest in sustainability? How do you kind of put money into both companies that are, in inorganic acquisitions and startup investments? How do you put money into companies that actually enable this transition? And then more broadly, when we're thinking about investments organically, what are we doing to kind of enable better recyclability, better recycling systems of our own products? And how do you kind of enable that more globally?
Maybe I can give it a try as well and explain a little bit. One thing that I think is really relevant is the composition of your scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions per company, and that can along the value chain can be very different in terms of what percentage scope 3 makes of your overall carbon footprint as a company. And so how we look at it in Dow is that we have already reduced over the last 15 years 15% of our carbon emissions, while as well providing more material to our customers. So there has been already quite progress made on our carbon emission reductions. We plan another 15% till 2030. And you can say 30% total versus 2005. May not sound much, but the nature of the game is really in where the emissions sits that we have in scope 1 and 2, and they sit in many of our large assets where we make the monomers for our polymer production, which are called crackers. And these are large emitters for CO2. For example, Terneuzen in the Netherlands, which is one of our largest sites in Europe, has 4 million tons of CO2 emissions annually. And in order to reach net zero for this site by 2050, 2030 would be lovely, but that's not easily achievable. We have a really multi-generational plan to decarbonize our production with different generations of plans of emission reductions, and we are confident that we can achieve that. But however, these are major investments that we need to make across the globe at all of our sites. We have another site in Alberta in North America where we have the plans for a carbon neutral site by in 2026. So that we will install new technology which involves capturing all the gases that we emit and eventually liquefying the CO2 and storing it while using hydrogen as a fuel for our crackers. So there's a lot of effort on our scope 1 and 2 emissions. But let's also quickly talk about the scope 3 emissions, which ultimately relate very much to the feedstocks that we are using historically, obviously fossil feedstocks that are used for polymer production. And those we are gradually also intending to phase out. And the sustainability pillars that we're looking at are using mechanical recycling to provide with alternative feedstocks their materials to the market, but as well using both circular or chemical recycling, advanced recycling, plus bio-based feedstocks in order to move away from fossil fuel, and by this reduce the exposure of our industry, plastics industry, to plastic packaging industry, to fossil feedstocks, which is ultimately then reducing our scope 3 emissions gradually as much as possible, and the market is supporting us to do so. In a way, these are the big flagship projects and efforts that we're doing. We announced actually 2 weeks ago that we intend to have by 2030 3 million tons of circular solutions on the market, which will be based on plastic waste, will be based on bio-based materials, and as well including mechanical recycling. So that are very ambitious goals in by 2030 to work on our scope 3 emissions with circular solutions.
Thank you, Peter. And I wanted to ask you, what were the sort of main challenges you had to overcome on your journey towards net zero, and which are the biggest challenges that you still face?
You want me to start? I could. I mean,
yes, I guess that would kind of. Yes, you can. You're very welcome to start.
No, I think some of. I mean, we obviously there are many challenges that we are facing, but we are ready to tackle them in a constructive way. For sure, for the let's say plastic industries, the ones that are producing polyethylene, the carbon or the carbon emissions of our assets are one of the things that we really need to tackle, and they're often distributed in different countries, and they are very capital intensive. So really finding the investment climate and making sure that we can actually bring these products to the market with reduced product carbon footprints as well is essential to us to make sure that we can actually sustain the investments into this space. So finding the right ecosystems and the infrastructure and the drivers behind this from a market perspective are absolutely essential. And we see good signs that many brand owners have scope 3 reduction targets now in place. And so this we think will enable us to bring these substantial innovations forward. If we look at technology challenges there as well, obviously technology innovation challenges along the path. One of the key elements for the chemical industry and the plastic industry to decarbonize is ultimately building electrified crackers, meaning that we're using electricity and not fossil fuel to heat up the crackers and then really provide the materials and the energy intensive processes with it. Now, in order to change these, there needs to be a lot of material invention, how to make electricity available, or use electricity to heat up to 800, 900,000 degrees certain unit operations that we have. And so these are major technology challenges that we face, which we can't solve in the 2 to 3, 4, 5 years. That needs further time, and that is why for the chemical industry, the goals of significant reduction sit often between 2035 to 2045, where we believe that some of these technologies will be with a technology readiness level ready to be deployed. So there are a lot of challenges along the way, but last but not least, it's also about the circularity element, which if you look at the systemic report that recently was published on the future of the plastics industry, which to a certain degree serves the packaging industry, we see that in that space, the ultimate goal of net zero is only achievable by a combination of circularity, meaning that we replace fossil feedstocks with circular ones, and the emission reductions on our assets. So this combination of the two is really essential for reaching net zero as a plastics chemical industry, ultimately then also the packaging industry.
Thank you, Peter.
I would basically say there are three sets of challenges. Kind of linking back to what Peter was saying. The first one is monetary. All of the things that we can do in our four walls with economic benefit have been done already, right? So it's really around doing the next piece and the next piece that becomes successively more expensive, and requires an impetus and an initiative from the organization to kind of find a better way to do it, right? And really kind of put sustainability ahead of itself, ahead of saying, okay, this is not the cheapest way to do it, but it's the right way to do it. And that requires us to kind of think about things differently. It also changes in macroeconomic environment kind of also change that, right? So when energy prices fluctuate, there's a difference. Then you start talking about actually having renewable electricity running your ovens and not gas, right? So that's one big aspect of it. The second one is around technology challenges, similar to what Peter was saying. In general, the labels industry and packaging is actually quite a slow burn place, right? You put something and it takes years for it to percolate down because of equipment changes and kind of that move. So we are working on technology changes, kind of looking at how do you differentiate between products that are lower carbon, are fully circular than what you would actually do currently, and that requires a lot of effort into changing the products themselves, and then percolating it down also would take another effort because it really kind of needs to be driven over time. And then the last thing, obviously, which I alluded to a bit in the beginning, is around organizational impetus as well. So what you kind of say is you almost need a bit of you need a team of people who are actually looking ahead and kind of pulling, and then it takes time, and the organization comes behind it, right? Because you don't want people who are doing the sales to be thinking about what's going to happen in the next 5 to 10 years. You really need like a very small group to kind of pull that whole organization through. And at least for Avery, we are very much an execution-oriented company. This kind of way of working really is taking time to kind of work through. But actually, I mean, we can actually see the culture change in the company itself, where you start seeing a lot of these ideas coming and then getting pulled through, right? So I think those are the three things that we're kind of working through.
Yeah, let me add on this because I see many commonalities between what Shruti has said and Peter. I would say that main challenges, real challenges, comes together when you have high ambitions. And when Mondi started this journey into the sustainability a long time ago, we had a plan to grow responsibly. But from that, we needed to change because the market was changing. And so we started to develop just recently the MAP 2030, which is the Mondi Action Plan by 2030. To do what? Create circular-driven solutions created by empowered people who take actions on climate change. And the real challenge here is really to make 100% of our portfolio sustainable by end of life. We are already on a very good base because 78% of our portfolio is already defined by sustainable by end of life. But there is a rock bottom of packaging, which is very hard to change. And this change, the challenge is actually very on the customer side because it's a multi-stakeholder process. And deciding to go for more sustainable packaging is not an easy task for complex organizations. And when we're talking specifically about retailers, the whole value chain has to be included. And this is an exercise that is new for certain players, and it requires sometimes an attention on details to really deliver what is actually important. And as we said before, emissions is not always carbon emissions. It could be waste, it could be pollutions. So what is the end of life of the packaging? That's the challenge, is really to manage a multi-stakeholder approach in order to create what you have developed already through a solid scope 1, scope 2, scope 3 basis into a packaging that is actually going out into the market.
Thank you, Marco. And I wanted to ask you, Marco, and everybody, all of the packaging manufacturer panelists, what role has innovation played on this journey towards net zero? And I was wondering if you had any examples of packaging innovations your company came up with that helped along on that on the path towards that.
Yeah, thank you for asking me, because this is linked to the MAP 2030 that I mentioned before, circular driven solutions created by our people. We truly believe in the diversity of our people and the experience of our people to rethink about the material and supply chain. And so when we think at material, some of the product that we had already in our portfolio start to be the foundation for new solutions. And then I can mention about a very strong paper that is used now to wrap pallets instead of using stretch film, or another grade of paper that is used to hug and hold, we call bottles. So you eliminate all the shrink film that you can imagine is coming from as a waste from the beverage industry. But also we're thinking about the supply chain. The circularity is not new into the paper industry, but it becomes a very interesting argument when you're closing the loop. So basically, we collect the waste from our retailer and we return these in the form of merchandise or even more other solutions that could be packaging for e-commerce. So at the core of innovation, there is definitely our people, but there is also the partnership with customers and OEMs. Who are part of the change agency when we talk about sustainability in packaging.
Thank you, Marco. Shruti, would you maybe like to add the labels perspective to that?
Yes. So innovation is absolutely product innovation is absolutely part of what we need to be doing in this space. And I think a good example for that is what we call a clean flake solution, which basically goes on PET bottles, and it is actually, once you put it into the recycling process, it actually detaches and goes through the thin float process, so you can actually separate it, which then gives you clean PET at the output, right? This is something that we're very proud of. It took us a lot of time and effort to kind of get to this product, and this is something that we absolutely then said, look, this is the adhesive is actually more expensive than our normal product, but now we're actually putting it into every single adhesive that we have that goes on PET. So it's in our standard products as well. So Clean Flake is how we're actually now selling all of our products. So it actually goes through the recycling system properly for PET.
If I can add something, Elizabeth, then
absolutely, yes. I was just going to ask you. Yes.
I think what we see already is that there is a huge spectrum of innovation needed in order to achieve net zero. And I can start, and let me try to explain this bandwidth that I'm talking about. I mean, these are two packages that we have been working with various partners along the value chain. You see here many of those names mentioned, and we have multiple of those, and you see them at K as well these days, where we're talking about design for recycling and packaging so that we can make new packaging with it eventually. And this is something that this package here has been transformed in this package, and after recycling it. And so these are some of the examples: designed for recycling, to be able to make packaging reusable or recyclable at the end of its life. The second part, if you go to the other extreme, is what I already mentioned with electrified crackers. So if we want to have in the future carbon neutral or close to carbon neutral products, polyethylene coming to the value chain, then we need to work on the circularity, but as well on making the processes to make polyethylene as low carbon emission as possible. And electrified cracking is an example of that. And we have recently we started running a pilot line with electrified cracking together with Shell. So there's another collaboration. Collaboration is key for all of our efforts, where we really build new scale technology in order to do this. And the Mura announcement that we had made is another example where, with very advanced thermal processing of plastic waste, we can actually bring back high quality oil as an alternative to our crackers to make new materials. So there's all along the value chain innovation happening that enables us to really bring or to strive towards net zero ultimately. I think this is not one example. There is innovation needed in all of these elements, not least as well in the recycling or sorting and collection industry, where we will need new business model to bring more of plastic waste and other waste as well back into the ecosystems and make sure that we are reusing them. So without innovation, net zero, in my view, is not possible. So it's part of everything we do.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you, Peter. And I was wondering, as obviously there's a discussion about making packaging circular and having a low carbon footprint and being net zero. Do you think, in your experience, that these two always automatically go together, or is there sometimes a balance needed between reaching net zero and circular packaging? And how do you navigate this? I think I want to ask this both to packaging producers and also to Sarah, but yeah, maybe I'll start with Sarah's opinion on this, because yeah.
Sure. Thanks so much. Yeah, before I go into that, I just want to highlight something very key that Peter mentioned previously in terms of actually achieving that net zero. It's completely right. It will require some massive fundamental changes within the system in order for that to be achieved. There's a brilliant report, if anyone hasn't read it already, from Systemic on the sort of changes that are going to be needed for a net zero world, particularly within the plastic sector, specifically looking around sort of retrofitting systems and how we can use the existing fossil fuel-based plastic manufacturing systems with retrofits to use and replace carbon-intensive fuels and move towards electrification, as Peter said, and also the use of green hydrogen. That's a CapEx-efficient way of dealing with the problem, but it still doesn't get us to net zero emissions by 2050. It's still about a 27% gap. But in order to actually achieve net zero, we would have to further rely on the role of hydrogen and the role of alternative feedstocks from biological sources and also from CO2e capture. It assumes that we use more increased electricity within the production, and we know as a Carbon Trust the overall impact behind plastic is about 90% is in the upstream. So tackling that would definitely release further innovation and reduce further reduction opportunities. But to answer your question in terms of circularity and net zero, I think they both go hand in hand, and I think they're going to have to. Whilst I can talk about sort of how the fundamental changes are needed upstream in terms of help decarbonize that, a big portion of that, and also what's being pushed by brands, is that we have to use recycled content We have to have less reliance on fossil fuel feedstocks that are coming in from upstream as well. So that will require some fundamental changes in circularity, both in packaging design. It'll also reflect in terms of how that packaging is treated at end of life as well, which we know will need to be improved. So the more that that's embedded within the system, and the more that system is improved on the downstream element, the further circularity can be enhanced. Ideally, we're trying to get to a market for packaging and perhaps plastics as well, where the recycled content is more valued in terms of that economic value that's placed on it. Shruti made a really good point in terms of the fact that we've done everything that's economically viable at the minute, but we have to see economic value in terms of that using waste as a resource to go forward.
Thank you, Sarah. Has anybody got anything to add on that? Peter, maybe?
No, I think the part where I would argue that as well the legislators have a role to play or are playing a role. If you look at the single-use plastic directive or the expected PPWR packaging and packaging waste regulation, as it will be probably. These are major pieces of legislation that essentially set a framework and create market demand for recycled content in packaging. And so this will be really, really important to drive a transformational change in the industry, right? And I think simply by expecting to do the right thing with let's say brands. I mean, we are facing, as we said, the challenges of creating value with all the investments that are needed in this space. And there the overall regulatory space can help set the playing ground for us to work in and achieve then as well these kind of circularity targets, which ultimately then lead into the decarbonization or net zero targets that we all strive for as an industry. I think these are additional elements. There is not a single knob that we can leave unturned in order to drive towards this circular and net zero future.
Thank you, Peter. Yeah, Shruti or Marco, do you have anything to add on this question?
Yeah, I mean, if you listen to all the story, you boil it down, it comes very clear that it's actually the sentence that Ellen MacArthur said: if we want to achieve net zero, we have to focus 50% on our energy and 50% of our material to keep the material in circularity. And yes, to achieve this is a fundamental change. As Sarah mentioned about that, it's not easy. We were used to think in a linear model, and now we have to think in a circular model, which is out of our comfort zone. But we are getting there. We are ambassador of this model, and we see that there is a time for digestion in order to accept this change. So I have a material sold, and I have material coming back. How does it work? How we can balance? And Peter mentioned one word, which is actually very important in achieving the net zero or the circularity, is the collaboration. Collaboration is key. There is no way that we can achieve the net zero by just doing the right thing by our own. We need to think in terms of partnership, a large partnership in a holistic and systemic approach, where it's not actually the short-term win that actually will deliver the sustainability on the long term. We need a long-term partnership that is the objective is the sustainability long-term goal, and the business goal will come as a consequence.
I love the context of both adding the legislative and the collaboration pieces. Absolutely agree with that. I'm going to take a different tack. I'm going to say, in the current context, there is actually sometimes a trade-off between achieving zero carbon and circular products, and that is just because of the current context, right? And that's where you're saying you need to put collaboration in, and you need to think about how do you or legislation needs to really change to be enabling circularity to actually drive carbon zero. And it's a bit of few things, right? I mean, there is always a discussion around what are we thinking about in terms of reuse and refill models, for instance. How are they enabling circularity, but are they on the whole better from a cradle to grave context? And there are two aspects here that I think are very important. The first one is around the data. and actually being able to, and Sarah probably will agree with me 100%, which is actually understanding and kind of speaking the same language and kind of making sure that we are comparing apples and apples when we're talking about, what does an LCA look like, right? So the LCA needs to be kind of grounded in that fact. And number two is actually going away from comparing averages to actually comparing real data. And this is, we all know this when we're doing an LC analysis. Part of what we're talking about in the end state is a broad average of what the grave to back to cradle looks like. But that's not always the case, right? So we need to really understand it on a almost a per item level and kind of really tailor it that way. And then that kind of enables you to design systems that are much more, much more circular, that really kind of get to the net zero impact that we want and need.
Thank you, Shruti. Yes, I was wondering, obviously our packaging producers here, you'll work with a range of different customers and provide a range of different solutions. And I was wondering if you could talk me sort of through the process of how to create the optimal sort of solution with the lowest carbon footprint together with the customer. Is there sort of a process that you follow, and could you talk me through that a little bit?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah.
Yeah. Now, we mentioned before about the massive amount of money that has been invested in our paper mills in order to reduce our carbon footprint. And we have achieved so far a very good result. So we will continue to invest. There are clear plans to invest in the next years in order to continue to reduce this. This is the base. Now, I was mentioning before, let's make the base solid. At that point, Mondi has a unique position because it's in flexible packaging, and it combines the fiber-based and the polymer-based. And by thinking smart on how we can design packaging with a material that is sustainable at the end of life, we came up with the statement, let's use paper where possible and plastic really when it's useful, as long as it's sustainable by end of life. And bringing this concept into product and then into actions into the market, we have a model that is called the eco solutions approach. What is all about? We mentioned this also before in the conversation. Everybody has his own journey, and some are longer, some are more challenging, some are more fragmented. Like retailer have definitely in their own private label portfolio a number of different packaging, a number of different vendors. And so to do this, it's about clearly define what is the focus of the sustainability agenda. So is it waste? Is it CO2? Is it forest? Is it water? Whatever it is, the dimensions that matters. And then come with an implementation, selection and implementation of a solution that needs to be reviewed because the market is changing, consumers are changing, legislation is changing. And so it is an approach that it is not purely transactional, it's circular by itself in the way we do business together. And this, I think, is a winning factor because we see that once one solution is adopted, we move to the next one. It creates a sense of pride and see that some impact has been delivered.
Thank you, Marco. Would anybody else like to add anything to that?
I think maybe a comment from my side, the one point that I would also highlight is that even for a plastics or polyethylene provider to the packaging industry, we see a lot of discussions ongoing with customers, what they actually want to achieve, and also with the customers of reducing carbon emissions or making a product more recyclable. And we have worked a lot with our customers on making monomaterial packaging available that has still a good print feature, has a stiffness, the functionality like these packages here that I showed you before, so that they actually can be successful on the shelf with the brands and with the customers and the consumers. And I think what we see is that the interest and the drive is becoming stronger and stronger, and that there's a lot of discussion or need for discussion along the value chain in order to figure out what a right solution looks like and how we can implement that together, because we need to supply certain materials to the packaging converters in Europe so that they can enable these kind of transformations. They have to, or they are working on their part of the designing these packages. We help them, but then as well, ultimately, we have an interest to take these materials back when they have passed the consumer so that we can recycle them. So I think these discussions take now much more room in any of the product design discussions than they have been in the past that I was part of. So I see this really as an exciting element of going us forward, that we really are collaborating more and more along the value chain.
Thank you, Peter. Shruti, would you like to add anything?
Basically, I think I think it's a I agree with what the others have said. I think the specificity here is around what is the product going to be fit for, right? And that is really part of the discussions we have often. I think the little bit of concern I have in general is, as Marco had pointed out, we can create the products in a vacuum and say here's what we want to be doing, but at a point there are decision makers at the end that kind of say this is what we want, and sometimes the brand decision becomes more imperative than the actual packaging and the impact and sustainability. And I think that is the big piece that we want to be tackling in the next few years, which is how do we change the discussion from I want this, I'm keeping the brand and I'm keeping that. I have a certain vision, and that's the only degree of freedom I have. And then you kind of have to go to here's different ways that we can actually get a much more sustainable product and design out.
Thank you, Shruti. Yeah, I think it's important to be sort of look at the big picture and be sort of more solutions driven and not get too sidetracked by specific.
Let me add one thing, because it's beautiful to talk about conversation and language. And I think what we need to learn is to speak the language of our consumers. We're still keeping the language as business to business or expert to expert, but it's the consumer who actually will drive really their choices and the impact. We need to transform our product in terms that our consumer can really understand what is about. Plastic looks like plastic, but what is a recyclable plastic? What can I do with recyclable plastic? That level of conversation is our language, and also our imperative to learn to express ourselves in a more simple and direct way so the consumer can make the choice.
Thank you, Marco. And in sort of summary, Sarah, what was sort of said previously, I think you hinted at it already, but just also for the benefit of our listeners who come from all sorts of different companies and backgrounds, what would be your advice for companies to reach their net zero goals? What steps they can take to get there?
Definitely steps to take there would start by understanding your organizational's carbon footprint when it comes down to sort of looking at it on a net zero scale. Shruti already rightly pointed out that I would agree with that, and I definitely do. When you understand in terms of how you compare life cycle assessments and making sure that you're on a common ground in terms of how you're doing that calculation. But specifically in that first net zero journey, understanding what that baseline footprint looks like is fundamental. The next is to really appreciate in terms of how that target looks, in terms of what it's going to take to get to net zero. So we know that it's an ambitious target. We know that it's going to be a 90% reduction across your scope 1, 2, and 3. So to understand that, you have to understand that overall baseline footprint, understand when those hotspots are, and work within your own organization of what can be tackled specifically. So understanding where those key reductions can be unlocked, whether they be upstream, whether they be downstream, are very key. It completely depends on what sector you're in. Specifically with packaging, a lot of the emissions are associated upstream, and many will rely on technological advances that may be outside your control at the minute. But in the near term, in terms of what can be achieved, you can look in terms of, for instance, feedstock, what key raw materials you're bringing in, what key suppliers you're working with, what technologies are a bit more within grasp is also key. And then understanding that in terms of a hypothetical scenario. So a lot of the work that we do with our corporate clients is working on feasibility studies. So we help quantify what those emissions will look like under different scenario approaches, which can really help towards building a net zero transition strategy. It's also worth highlighting as well that you have to take into account the end goal in terms of what that offsetting market looks like as well. So thinking about where you're going to place your investments, how you're going to move towards beyond value chain mitigation as well, is also really important to consider.
Thank you. And I also wanted to ask you, Sarah, sometimes manufacturers from the different packaging material sides say that their material is best, their material is the most circular or the most sort of easiest to achieve carbon zero, obviously present company excluded. But I wanted to ask you what your thoughts on that are, and if such claims are realistic, or if you think there is one packaging material that kind of comes out king, or if it's a bit more complex than that.
It is definitely more complex than that. It works in terms of, we get asked this all the time, especially when plastic pollution was front and center of everyone's newsfeed. We got a lot of our clients asking us what's going to give me the best reduction in terms of my net zero goal and my science-based target goal, whilst also making sure that I'm not contributing to plastic pollution in the natural environment. And there is no definitive answer to this, since what makes a good packaging is heavily depending on the context of the product. So we've done a lot of comparative studies. We did a more recent one, which is on our website. If you care to have a look, we can share that as well, I'm sure, for a comparative soft drink packaging. So this looks in terms of aluminium cans versus single-use glass versus a refillable glass solution, and also a single-use plastic within a European context. And the key things that drove the carbon footprint of this were the carbon intensity of the electricity used on where it was produced, the recycling rate at the end of life, recycled content in the packaging, the reuse rate for the refillable packaging, and also the transportation and distribution distances as well. Those were transportation rather quite small in terms of overall impact. But behind all that, in terms of what the key levers to pull, you can see in terms of the results, which I again can share, on how much that can contribute in different scenarios.
Thank you, Sarah. So yeah, we're almost at the end of our time together. So I wanted to ask one final question to everybody. I was wondering, what's the scope of sort of learning from each other on this journey, and maybe even collaborating amongst competitors to reach our goal? Sort of, is that something you would consider? Obviously, collaboration across the value chain, but maybe also collaboration across competitors might be a good idea. But yeah, I just wanted, in conclusion, sort of put that question to you, what your thoughts are on that.
My team spends around 20 to 30% of their time talking to other people in the ecosystem. And there is no answer that we can get to that only works for our company, right? So anything that we need to do as an industry. And that goes just as much for labels, as much for the overall packaging space.
Thank you, Shruti.
Yeah, just very quickly, for me, the terms competition is obsolete. It doesn't fit anymore in the context we are living, where actions are needed only when we bring together companies with different competencies. And the terms competition doesn't actually matter anymore.
Thank you, Marco.
And maybe also commenting on two questions in the chat. I think we use a lot the word or which, and it's probably more the word and that we need. I mean, the question was regarding mechanical recycling or chemical recycling or bio-based feedstocks. And the point is and. It's not or, but it's and we need all of these solutions across the collaboration space and across the companies. We all are in this together, and of course there will be some competition between companies. That is also that we drive ourselves into better and better spaces through competition. But on the other hand, we need to realize that we don't really gain a lot by picking the winner, because there is probably not one winner, or in terms of solution space, or even in terms of companies, but there will be really a collaborative space that we need to develop to drive these solutions and bring them to the market. I would agree with Marco there very much.
Yes, thank you very much, Peter. You've also kind of elegantly incorporated some audience questions there. So yeah, that's great. So yeah, unfortunately, that's all we've got time for today. But obviously, we can continue the discussion on LinkedIn. I think we'll probably get some more questions as people watch this session on demand, and obviously, we'll all stay in touch and sort of have this discussion sort of further going forward. So yeah, thank you everybody for joining this session today. And obviously, as you are probably aware of, this panel discussion is part of our Sustainable Packaging Summit regular series of virtual panels. And yeah, make sure you subscribe to Packaging Europe, and also obviously follow our LinkedIn channel to get updates on upcoming discussions in the coming months. And also, if you're interested in attending another sort of Packaging Europe's in-person events, I can recommend our Innovation Horizon conference in Amsterdam on November 15th, which takes place at the same time as the IPA World Congress and brings together leaders in investment, FMCG, manufacturing, R&D, and also startups, and we'll sort of work together and come together to accelerate transformative sustainable packaging innovation. So yeah, for now that just leaves me to thank our speakers, Shruti George, Peter Sandkühler, Marco Maccarati, and Sarah Laidler. And yeah, thank you very much, everybody, for being on the panel today and for taking time to be here today. Thank you.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Much.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you. Goodbye.